Now it's my pleasure to introduce your presenter today, Peyton Marshall. Since 1985, Peyton Marshall has served in product management, sales, and senior management roles in a number of B2B sectors. For 12 years, he was an investment banker, most of that time at Goldman Sachs, structuring and selling complex and innovative financial solutions to global corporate and financial institution CFOs. Since 1997, he has been on the receiving end of all kinds of sales approaches as CFO of 3 public biotech companies, CEO of 1 public biotech company, and COO of a private drug discovery company. He has been CEO and chairman of Leverage Point since 2012. So with that, Peyton, welcome.
Thanks, Taylor, and glad to have everyone here today. It's no surprise we live in a world with limited consensus and a lot of apparent divisions. That's really nothing new. What's interesting is in B2B enterprises, there's almost complete agreement on one point: the fundamental need for a value proposition. Value propositions are crucial to new product launch. In a survey of executives by Altify, they found that value proposition quality was the #1 reason product launches succeed, and also the #1 reason that product launches fail. Buyer executives also focus on value propositions. This survey of buyer executives found that the first vendor to communicate a vision of value won the business 3/4 of the time. Finally, sales trainers, sales advisors, and sales executives focus on problems that value propositions address. One of the big sales trainers, Richardson Training, surveyed sales executives on the top closing challenges. And the top 3 closing challenges were competing against a low-cost provider, differentiating your product, and creating a compelling case versus doing nothing. All 3 of these problems are problems that value propositions address. So everyone says they need a value proposition, but what do they actually think a value proposition is? When you go out and talk to people, you find that value propositions mean different things to different people. To some, it's an image or a visual. To others, it's a bullet point summary, a good verbal description, maybe with some icons. And to others, it's a mathematical analysis. The sales challenges can be even greater in the age of specialization within sales teams. We're in a world of pre-sales professionals, solution consultants, sales engineers, business development managers. We've got our solution architects. We've got our customer-facing product managers. And with all those different roles, sales should be a team sport. But like any team sport, as any coach will tell you, you've got different players on the field with skills, experiences, and temperaments that are not necessarily the same. The challenge in that team sport world is inconsistent tools used by different team members. The result is often jumbled messages. Of course, sales faces challenges on the buyer side. They face serious buyer uncertainty in what's going on with the buyers themselves. Uncertainty #1 is what I call buyer stakeholder uncertainty. Increasingly, buyers make consensus decisions. This Harvard Business Review article surveys showed that the average buying group size is more than 5 people. In the midst of that, that means uncertainty about which stakeholder has clout, what the roles of different stakeholders on the buyer's side are, and what their actual involvement in a buying process may be. With that uncertainty also comes the needs of different individuals among those buyer stakeholders. Who needs to know what standards of proof do different buyer stakeholders have? The second uncertainty is buying process uncertainty. where the typical buyer goes through a process where first they're looking at alternatives, identifying, prioritizing, deciding what they want to look into in more detail organizationally before they pull a team together to evaluate and reach the final sort of decision to move forward, negotiate a purchase. And as sellers face those buying processes, the first thing is customer buying processes are often unclear, opaque, uncertain to sales teams. Second problem is sometimes the buyers don't understand their own process themselves and they're making it up. Despite the uncertainties though, sales can count on buyers needing a few answers. What positive impacts can buyers of my product expect on their business? Is my solution better for buyers than the alternative? And is my solution worth the cost? And the interesting thing is you think about how those questions come up through the buying process. It's often the case that different stakeholders sometimes are involved, ask more than once. It may be at different points in the process. It may be versus different alternatives. And they may want different level of rigor in their answers. Sales teams then really need to think about objectives in addressing those three questions efficiently and effectively. First, sometimes they're addressing those questions with an objective really just to advance the process, move the ball down the field. And value can help with that early in the process, not at a point of decision, but just at a point of getting a customer to move forward into evaluation. Second, the team's objective should be and is for the best teams to invite the customer to talk and to trust the sales team. Third, an objective to provide clear, crisp, simple answers to questions. And just as important, provide only as much information as necessary. Too much information often takes sales processes off track. Price may come up early. A good sales rep knows to have a clear, crisp answer to the price question because a customer may not decide to evaluate unless they know something about the price, but you can count on the price coming up late. So when you think about a value proposition becomes a content roadmap for sales. Because a value proposition answers the fundamental question, what do we do for our customers? Value propositions turn product-centric one-way presentations into customer-centric conversations. And in doing that, they provide clear answers to simple questions. What are the three things that make you better than the alternative? How much better are you? And what is that worth to the customer? So value propositions become core content for customer engagement throughout a buying process. If you think about a buying process then, and you think about a value proposition that can actually be applied at different stages in different ways, it can almost start early in the process as a flexible case study or an illustration of the value you can create using typical data. Then as going into the evaluation phase, it can begin to become an actual customer value analysis that can be worked on, agreed, beaten up in a diligence process, and actually can then become a shared business case to buy with customer sponsors. So when you think about it this way, different objectives. Early in the sales process, move the ball down the field. Sales is out to connect, qualify, differentiate. In the middle of the process, that's where team selling is brought most to bear. That's where pre-sales professionals are being brought in to help credentialize, help prove. But at the same time, they're really looking to engage the customer as well. And in many cases, to sort of customize a solution to that specific target. So that by the end, you actually have sponsor buy-in and a simple agreed value proposition that sales and the sponsor can use to help speed procurement, negotiation, and closing. So what becomes really important in these sales conversations is to keep it simple and on point. A good value proposition provides options. Why go deeper into a conversation than a customer needs to go? And thinking about the depth of different conversations, it's important to understand there really are 3 layers of value. The first layer is qualitative. Our solution is more energy efficient, as an example. To turn that qualitative value driver into a quantitative one, you're talking about putting a number next to it, but it need not be a dollar number. Our solution reduces energy consumption by 35%, so quantitative value. And third is financial, or what Stefan Liozu calls dollarized value. For that facility, we reduced energy cost by $4.2 million per year. Beware, there are 4 common attitude problems in building value propositions. The first one is we need exact data to start. Second, leave the price till later. Hold it until the end of the cycle. Third, we need the value engineer. The value engineer has to come in to have those value conversations. That's often connected to the fourth, which is just present the spreadsheet. Value proposition conversations are not the same as presenting a spreadsheet. Designing a value proposition is really about designing a tool where it's all about users, usefulness, and usability. Who's going to be using it? When are different users going to be using it, and what kinds of conversations, and how might they be using it? So it becomes important when you think about a value proposition to then begin to think about layering. So what do I mean by layering? I want to try and give you an example, and this is just an illustrative example with a reference case study, as to how options and how different views of the same value proposition in a sales cycle can be set up and utilized effectively by a sales team. So let's look at a value proposition. And I'm going to look specifically at a value proposition for a software solution that can be used by financial services firms and others for trading compliance. And we all know we're in a world where that's highly regulated and mistakes are costly. So here what you see opening this value proposition, first and foremost, is a case study. Not necessarily by name, but what I've got is a situation that really sort of summarizes a problem that another customer had, what their problem was, and what trading compliance software did for them. And as you see, I've got this in a form where if I'm going to a new customer, it's nice to have a little bit of customization. So I'm going to see that famous brokerage firm, Jones Adams, Pierce, Fenner, and Barney. And I begin to customize my value proposition as I go. Now, what's interesting here is in going in, I'm going to talk primarily about that other customer. I'm going to get in the mode of what their problems were. Here's the kind of slide that might be used in a sales conversation, really to see whether all 3 of these potential benefits resonate with a customer. Sometimes, risk reduction isn't high on their list, or they're not worried about it. And having a way to test that is part of the way that a sales rep may want to qualify the account. Before they then begin to talk about, so what did our solution actually do for this other customer? Well, as you can see, and in this case it's financial information, but for that other customer, we managed to save them $1 million in compliance costs, $1.25 million in employee retention costs, and $500,000 in risk reduction. And so you've already sort of gotten into a little bit of a financial conversation, but without, by the way, without prices, but talking about benefits and trying to engage them. and in the context of another customer. So what was the nature of that customer? So I'm glad you asked. So as you can see, this was a 10,000 employee customer that had an average cost to replace an employee of $25,000 and total trades per year of 810,000. And so was it really worth it to them relative to the cost of this? Well, again, as you can see illustratively with these numbers, our software was generating $2.9 million versus a cost for them of $900,000. And again, whether you want to go that deep or not, the sales rep can decide using some of these screens versus others. They can decide. But what that also does is begin to invite a little bit of adaptation to that specific customer. So let's think about your situation. How many employees do you have? So, turns out that this particular brokerage firm is a pretty big one. And we can begin to adapt and think about their situation. Have you ever considered what it costs you to replace an employee? And as you're going, there's good basis to have that conversation. And as you're doing it, it's becoming their value proposition. And of course, what I want to do as I do that, is hold on to the data, because my aim in this meeting is to get the right next meeting. It's to get the right people in the room. And I may want a much deeper presentation for that conversation. So now I'm ready for that next meeting, and I look at a different view of the same information. I come to a view that, again, to give you a sense of look and feel, we pose the problem that the customer faces, in a different visual way here, but with consistent messages and images: administrative costs, turnover costs, compliance risk. And again, try and get them talking to make sure all three of these issues resonate or are a challenge for them. But then what we might want to do is get more deeply into individual value drivers. So efficiency, where we've got a qualitative and somewhat quantitative message, and we can talk about a per employee administrative costs. But what we also have is, so let's see what the assumptions might be for you. So have you done an analysis of your reporting cost per trade? And I'm going to begin to make changes where I'm actually changing the math, not necessarily putting the math in the customer's face, but modifying and adapting it. And if they've got questions, we can click on the way math is calculated, but it's not in their face. So I always think of this as you only want to go as deep as the questions go. So that as you're modifying and adapting it now, as I get toward the end, what I'm doing is I've got a summary that now is really turning into their value proposition. It's moving toward this shared business case to buy. So that now when we look at the business case here, what I've got is all the information that I've already captured. It's there, it's become theirs. I've still got an ability, for example, to refine some of the assumptions. So, we're still learning things about the customer. You never end up knowing everything. But as you're doing that, you're getting to a point where now price comes back into the picture. In the previous view, you saw no prices at all. But here we've got an ability later in the sales cycle to actually talk about specifics of pricing, how long a contract period. Or we may even have different pricing models, where in this case, there are two models to price this particular software, seat-based and transaction-based. And I've got an easy, flexible way to compare those. So that's really to try and take, a specific situation and give you kind of a concrete example of how a layered value proposition, how a value proposition that it can be structured that actually works at different stages with different users in the sales cycle. So how do teams get there? Well, we'll start with Confucius. If you want teams to do good work, they need sharp tools. Great value propositions don't just happen. They evolve from agile collaboration. It starts with the content, and it starts with quantifying and understanding the value to try and refine the actual both financial and quantitative content. But from there, it moves into making that content usable, and that's a very important second step, because great value propositions need to be useful not only by the author of the math, but by others. And in a typical sort of marketing process, you would come to good content and even usable content and publish it perhaps with a mind to sales use. I think it's very important to begin to understand then as you publish it, who are the users, how are they going to use it, what do they actually want. But the important thing in getting sales adoption and sales success is to have some agility, where there's actual feedback from early sales use. And that feedback results in improved quality of the quantitative and other content, but also improved usability, so that that value proposition continues to improve. So to make value propositions useful, let's look at 3 things to think about as you do that. First, ask a question. How will buyers think about buying? A few dimensions to the answer. The first is, what are their comparative reference points? Are they likely to compare you versus no decision for doing things the way they do it today? Might they have some other comparative reference points versus a direct competitor, or both? You want to prepare for that. Second, what do you understand about buyers, different buyer segments, different buyer use cases? How can that help change or modify the messages and even the content that apply to different buyers? Third, what's the buyer's frame of reference? It's often a time period. That's what finance people are often asking about. It may be a contract period, or all finance people want to know annual financial impacts, but it may also be operating. So if it's a manufacturer, a natural reference point is per unit of their own, of the good that they produce. So think about your buyer frame of reference, and even think about giving them different points of reference as they consider the answers and as they consider the quantification. Number 2, think about matching content to a sales process and start somewhere. You don't need to boil the ocean, but depending on where you're thinking of having the value conversation, think about it in terms of where in the process it is. So for example, in the early part of the sales cycle, where using values about identifying and prioritizing, there's some questions that sales wants to ask. Does our solution fit the customer? Do our advantages resonate with them? Let's figure out whether I'm going to spend time on this customer. With the customer themselves, there are a few sort of objectives, which is to get them to believe that we understand and can solve their problem, and that it's worth their while to evaluate us. In the middle part of the sales cycle, again, this is the more team-oriented part, and it's often the part where pre-sales and product experts and solution consultants are involved. But we're now at a point where we're getting into a deeper understanding of their business, while at the same time, we're demonstrating that we're better. In some cases, they're looking for us to prove it. Our solution improves their performance. In many cases, we're also looking to tailor our solution to them as we deal with different stakeholders and look to build consensus. So that by the end, you're really into this stage of value proposition co-ownership with your sponsor, customer buy-in, support their process, and create urgency. 3, in making value propositions useful, look at your content and then work backwards. So let's think of those layers. There's that financial layer, the quantitative layer, and the qualitative layer. And let's almost work from the bottom up, where we know toward the, in this financial end, you need summary financials, graphs. As you're getting to the proof points, you need some detail on where you're different quantitatively, qualitatively, and financially, value driver detail. But there's also, and never lose sight of the fact, there's customer data here. And think about how that's going to work in the value proposition, as well as your claims data. But then this is a marketing tool, and it's a marketing instrument. And all good marketing needs to think about messages, images, and usability. So let's take each one of these in turn and look at them in a little more detail. So let's start with summary financials. And a lot of this is actually covered in the white paper on offer today in a little more detail than I'll be able to provide in just a few minutes here. But I want to hit some of the high spots. So start with summary financials. There are always numerical financial answers. And the first of those is the bottom line, the value to the customer net of the price. So it's important here to be clear, compared to what? If you buy mine, what am I comparing it to? And it's important with summary numbers to be clear about units. Over what horizon or per what in terms of unit of output. But there are other relevant numerical answers. Some of them are more suitable to some situations than others. There's ROI, return on investment, which is typically most relevant when the competitive reference point is no decision, because there's a lot of potential for ambiguity in that measure. But it tends to be a measure that's useful early in the sales cycle and potentially late. There's payback. Payback is a time-based measure where you're really just looking at a break-even time period. That's most useful as a numerical answer. It's most relevant if the timing of a customer's outlays and benefits differ substantially between your solution and the reference point. Payback is always a supplemental answer because it ignores two things. It ignores both what are your sources of value, but it also kind of misses the scale of the value you create. At the very least, ROI and the bottom line both get at the scale of that value. And third, there's differential value. There's the value you create without including the price. And that's a really good measure and summary measure in the middle of the sales cycle. If you think back to the value proposition I showed a couple minutes ago, that middle view, that value analysis view, had a discussion and a discussion platform that was there and usable without any pricing information, where you're really just trying to get into what are the things you're going to deliver. So differential value highlights differentiation. Tactically, it helps teams sell the value before they sell the price, and it's useful early and in the middle of the sales cycle. So when it's applicable, it's a good idea to make all of these measures available. But it's never enough to just have numbers. Graphs go beyond summary numbers, and they're important to visualize value and differentiation. So there are two summary graph approaches. The first is the side-by-side comparison, which you often see in total cost of ownership type slides. And as a way to organize information, it's a very natural approach. It's them versus us. It's before versus after. It's the weight loss commercial. So that's really one of the simplest ways to organize content. And it's very intuitive. The other approach, though, highlights your differences, highlights your impacts. And I'll refer to that very broadly as the economic value approach, because what each of these items are that you see are the net value you're creating in energy, in downtime, in maintenance. So those are differences as opposed to side-by-side display. And when you look at these two approaches, if all your differentiation impacts your customers' costs, that side-by-side comparison works very, very well. As a comparison, though, it's really not as broad because it's really hard to think about what does that side-by-side graph look like if you're creating revenue for your customer as well as reducing costs, or if there are risk differences. The economic value or the waterfall or the stack, those differences may not be as intuitive to some, so got to do a little more sales training there, but it's the broadest framework, and it readily includes cost, revenue, and risk differences. So as a way to illustrate all of those differences, and many great solutions impact all those things for their customer, it's the broadest framework. So for the side-by-side comparison, one of the drawbacks is too much information. People tend to do those graphs with 8, 10 stacks, but I guess some people are carried away. The primary drawback of that side-by-side comparison is it doesn't accentuate the differentiation very well. You actually you don't know what's important in creating the value when you look at the side-by-side comparison. The economic value approach, though, is very strong if your reference alternative is no decision. But visually, what it also does is highlight the differentiation, highlight the impact, highlight the net effect. So let's look a little further just at that economic value approach, because there are even some graphical choices there. There are 3 different ways to organize the content. There's the economic value estimation approach, which is all sources of value are shown as differences except for the price comparison. That's EVE a la Nagel, Holden, and their co-authors over the years. There's another approach, which is to display everything as differences. And that approach includes the pricing difference between your solution and the competitor. That's an especially useful approach when there are variable amounts of your good they might buy versus the competitor. If, for example, you're a chemical that goes into a formulation and you're more productive, or if you're a more durable piece of equipment, and the replacement cycle may be different. And finally, there's cost-benefit kind of approach. The project managers love that. It's a broad approach. There's a lot of flexibility in organizing the displays. But one thing you'll notice is it's a simpler graph, and that can be good in that it's kind of simple communication. But what it misses is it doesn't highlight as well your resonating points of differentiation. So there are always trade-offs. So there are also graphs that go with ROI and payback. So with ROI, you can look at how much incremental value do you add versus the incremental investment. So that's just a ratio. And for payback, it's interesting to have a sort of time-based graph so that people can see break-even points in a cycle. So now let's move into a little bit more of the value proposition detail in customer conversations. Because the sales team has a number of objectives here. Qualifying and validating, are we relevant? Do our advantages resonate? Engaging and credentializing, we understand their business, they can trust us. Differentiating and proving, our solution's different, it's better, and we will reliably deliver results. So when you think about a value driver, a single point of differentiation that has qualitative, quantitative, and financial impacts, there's 3 kinds of information in it. There's the value driver qualitatively itself in a formula. There's customer data, economic and operating. Then there's claims data. You know, what does our product do better and what claim are we making? And as you think about those elements, after setup, and after you've got things going on, you really should test about how you would talk about it with a customer, because that gets at the question of, is it usable? So let's drill down first into the value driver detail. Sales teams need simpler options than spreadsheet calculator display. So consider providing a natural way to discuss whether a qualitative value driver applies. That gets to some of these qualifying questions. Are we relevant to the customer? Do our advantages resonate? But on the quantitative side, it's also good to have a simple way to express those advantages, because those get fundamentally and often, without the financials, into our solution being differentiated, our solution reliably delivering results. Third, think about the formulae. You don't want them in customers' faces, but it's good to have them available. And what that does is it helps with building trust, it helps with some collaboration, and it helps persuade the customer that we will reliably deliver. And last, of course, graphs help, because graphs can highlight how we're differentiated. Next, customer data. So this is what information on their side helps us turn this into a persuasive case, a business case to buy. Rule number 1, requiring too much discovery before you have any kind of content is a barrier to adoption. Instead, use benchmark data. Using benchmark data is not a problem. Starting with good benchmark data helps customers actually know that we already understand their business. We've worked with other people in their industry before, and then we're collaborative. We can change that data, and they can trust us to modify and get them a solution that's customized to them. Second, feature a few key assumptions at a time. Asking 20 questions or showing 20 pieces of data is overload. What those few key assumptions do is, again, they help us get to, are we relevant to the customer? Do we understand and helps engage and credentialize them as we start to talk to them about their business. Third, consider mixing customer and claims data. Having the two together is actually a good way to have a combined conversation. To get into, we understand their problems in business, and and hypothetically, based on what we've done for others, we would reliably deliver these kinds of results. And it can be very good tactically to have a mix of that information as you get into the conversation. Next, have a convenient place to go where you can see the customer-specific data. That, again, helps address the question, have we really modified it to their situation? Do we really understand them? And finally, having pricing information available, but not in your face or not required, can be very helpful. Because if they ask the question, we can answer. We're collaborative. They can trust us. And again, it helps get at this question of, we reliably deliver results. So now let's shift to the claims data. What do we do better? Don't be defensive. There are many good bases for claims. It always starts with initial hypotheses, case studies, alpha customers, beta customers, early adopters, pilots. What do you learn from your first customers in your test cases that can help move a hypothesis into a plausible claim? There are then many other sources: development work, studies, market research, customer interviews, surveys, outcomes. And as you think about all this, it's just a few suggestions. Where you have them, have your sources and references quickly available so you can answer the question, where does that come from? That helps build trust and prove out your results. Highlight your quantitative advantages if they're solid. Again, that's getting to differentiation, delivering results, and proving we understand them. Finally, consider mixing customer and claims data. Again, for some of the reasons that mixing these conversations can be a very propositions need to have clear, crisp, and consistent messages for customers and for sales teams. Images, visuals matter. There's so many studies on how visuals matter. This is just one of them. And this one just says in comparing verbal messages versus visual and verbal messages, audiences are 6.5 times as likely to remember that message if you've got a visual. So think about how you have memorable images in your value props. And finally, we're in a digital age. Tools need to be usable. Steve Jobs understood this very, very well. It was, to him, not about the technology. It was about his users. It was about thinking of tools, understanding or having initial views of use cases, but then really understanding that very smart people find ways, and even not so smart people find ways to use tools. And you can learn from that. You can make the tools better as they do great things with them. So to bring it all together, value propositions are worth the investment. They deliver results by building sales confidence. The use of value proposition opportunities in B2B enterprises deploying them typically find a 5 to 15% higher close rate and 5 to 25% higher price.
Hi all, I am not sure if people can hear me. I really apologize about that, that blip we had there. We are on a question for Peyton here, so if you can hear, please stay tuned. How do you get quantitative value teams to have more of a marketing orientation?
Great question. So one of the best ways to do that is ask the spreadsheet author first to present. Have them present to others. Get them in a mode of presentation. But then ask the spreadsheet author, how might they have a conversation with it? Not a monologue, but a dialogue. How would they use it interactively? Because that's a good way to evolve that spreadsheet into a better conversational tool. But you're never done. You've never gone far enough until you actually say, okay, let's have someone other than the person who designed the spreadsheet, other than the person who did the math, let's have someone else present, have a conversation with it. And I think all of that sort of drives you towards a marketing orientation, drives you towards usability by others, drives you towards better messages. Because if a new user can't pick up a value proposition and see directly from it what the key messages are, how they can explain them simply, what some of the obvious items that they might want to change or not change would be, then you haven't tested it enough. So that's a sign, if you haven't done that, the way to get to messages, usability, and images all at the same time is getting other people and watching other people to use it.
Great, thanks. All right, and a question that just came in. As a pricing professional, what approach would you suggest using in addressing this topic with sales, such that they don't get the impression that pricing is attempting to tell them how to do their job?
Great question. The first and most important and best approach I've seen to that is make friends with one or two sales or pre-sales people, because having that person's credibility of how a value proposition helped them in sales can be critical. When a pricing person comes in, everybody knows that they're going to want to talk about price achievements. When a salesperson talks about it, or a pre-sales professional talks about it, and talks about how they talked about value, that's going to add credibility in an important way. Sometimes that can be sales management. Sometimes it can be a friendly pre-sales person. But I think that's kind of important. Rule number one is find a collaborator with genuine sales experience. And rule number two is pointing and clicking and talking quantification is way less important than talking about what benefits are in it for sales, what benefits are in it for pre-sales. And the best way to do that is to use some combination of some survey data that can help. We do that all the time. Think about how a presentation of the value proposition is done that's more in a customer conversational way than a training, log in or open this and do these things. I think it's really important to sort of provide that kind of motivation. Not that pricing people necessarily want to be sales trainers, and I'm not suggesting they should, but you want to think about getting some kind of conversation about usefulness in the sales process going so that it's not just about the quantitative, financial, or even just about the qualitative content.
Great answer. And here's another one for you. Where do you get the quantitative content for value proposition?
Really good question. So, I think it's very interesting as we talk to people who haven't done this before. It's often the case that they already have it available in their hands in different shapes or forms. So, their marketing content often is very good at highlighting not just product differentiators, but qualitatively what those differentiators do for their customers. Think of them as benefits or impacts. But if you start with their pre-existing marketing materials, that helps you get, I think, usually very quickly to qualitative content. What can also help is if there are well-written case studies. That can help. Often there are some great hints to quantifying and dollarizing that are already sitting there. And sometimes that's information about customer economics that's just sitting in salespeople's head. They never thought about how to apply it. But if you find one or two collaborative salespeople to ask a few key questions about some of their customers, or even get them to have lunch with a friendly customer and try and understand their business better, that actually has benefits to them as well as to you. And I think the final thing is you'd be amazed at the pre-existing spreadsheets that smart pre-sales people have already come up with. And so finding those can be an interesting hint and an interesting direction to turning those into more broadly useful tools.
Great, thanks. And it looks like we have time for one last question, and this one is really specific to our tool itself. Do you provide a version of the value proposition to the customer so they can examine and test?
Sure. I mean, I think everyone who gets involved with us, will find that that it's really about where are they in the process and what would help them the most. And so I think a little bit that's case by case, but we recognize that to think about deploying a good tool, you need various ways to test and to prove it out. And it's critically important to all organizations looking at new tools to do that.
Exactly. Great. Thank you, Peyton. And before you all go, just a brief reminder that we are hosting another webinar next month, Transforming Case Studies into Digital Value Propositions, presented by Brian Hannon. And so if you're interested in registering for this webinar, just please check the appropriate box in the exit survey. And that's it from us for today. Thank you for taking the time to join us and sticking with us through those technical issues. And a special thank you for Peyton for his insights. And from all of us here at Leverage Point, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Take care.